Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and on Sundays I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. It is the last Sunday of October 2024, making it time for another president, which means this week's book is Jimmy Carter, a comprehensive biography from Plains to Post-Presidency by Peter G. Bourne. The accompanying cocktail is the Jimmy Carter cocktail. It is 1 ounce of white creme de coco, 1 ounce of whiskey. You can use brandy, bourbon, or scotch. I personally went with a peanut butter whiskey. It's appropriate to the cocktail and to Jimmy Carter's life. A teaspoon of creamy peanut butter. You blend it with crushed ice. Or, you can shake it with crushed ice and go for that. I'm just going to put it all in a blender. So let's do this. James Earl Carter Jr. was born October 1st, 1924 in Plains, Georgia, to James Earl Carter Sr., a.k.a. Earl, and Bessie Lillian Carter, a.k.a. Lillian. I was going to say something else, but no, that's what I was just, she went by her middle name. She went by Lillian. He was the couple's first child, and he would eventually be joined by Gloria, Ruth, and William, who, in a sad note, and apropos to nothing other than it's like, well, that's odd, they would all die in their 50s of pancreatic cancer. No idea why. Just to round out the weirdness, there was no causal link found between the three contracting pancreatic cancer. They just all did and all died of it. So Jimmy Carter's the only one who so far has not died of pancreatic cancer. Anyways, Carter had a fairly idyllic childhood. Like we're talking Leave It to Beaver idyllic, right? This instilled some good qualities in him. He believed in hard work and diligence. His mother was actually kind of an outlier for Plains, Georgia in 1920s and 1930s America, in that she was actually not a screaming racist bigot, which was pretty unusual. I mean, she was actually a trained nurse. It was right out of nursing school she married Earl, and Earl allowed her eccentricities. And I say that because he was a racist. But he loved his wife, and he allowed her more civilized tendencies because there wasn't really anything wrong with it. It kind of went along with the casual paternalistic racism of the 1920s and 30s in Georgia. It was interesting to read about Carter's childhood, and you can really see that his childhood, he was kind of a crossroads product of his time. I mean, his father wanted him to learn about hard work and the value of that work, so he gave Carter an acre of the family peanut farm to farm and to tend to himself, which Carter did. He used the proceeds from the sales of his peanuts to buy some shacks and turn them into rental properties. I think he was like 12 when he did this. So there was a very strong entrepreneurial spirit in the family that was fostered by his father. I have to blend this. This is going to be loud. He did not say how much ice to use. I think this is probably a little more watery than like the picture on the website from the cocktail shows. But so he was, he was young and he experienced the value of hard work. He raised his own crops, did his own harvesting, sold the bags, and then brought property with it. And that would actually later be used against him when he was campaigning. People would say he was a slumlord because of this, which not. All right. I mean, yes, they were shacks, but it was also the Great Depression. Everybody lived in shacks, so it really wasn't what people were trying to make it be during his campaigning. Now, during the Depression, Earl took advantage of all the FDR programs to further the family fortunes, which I don't fault him for that. This is what smart people do. This is how, millionaires and billionaires become millionaires and billionaires, is they look at what the laws are and they use those laws to their advantage. And that includes all tax breaks and government programs that allow them to get ahead. All right, we mere mortals just don't see that opportunity, and then we resent them for having taken the opportunity when it was presented to them. That is quite tasty. Damn it, I kind of wanted to hate this cocktail because I was kind of unimpressed with Carter as a president, but that's really damn tasty. Kind of wish I sprung for the big bottles of alcohol on this one. I'm going to have to go buy more bottles of alcohol to make more of this. World War II hit as Carter was entering high school, and he knew that he wanted to join the Navy, so he worked very hard. And he was only beat out for the valedictorian by, I think it was like shenanigans he got into while in school. I don't remember specifically what they were, although the anecdote is in the book. It didn't matter. The valedictorian came with a scholarship to a local school, and he had his sights set on the Naval Academy in Annapolis. He did do a few years at a local college before transferring to Annapolis, where he more or less kept to himself, kept his head down, and I believe graduated 59th in his class of 820, which is pretty impressive. He was definitely in the top, percentiles of his class. while on break from Annapolis one year, Carter was visiting his family and met his sister Ruth's friend Rosalind, and it was an instant match. I mean, they both knew that they would marry when each had finished their respective schools. Like, she was education, I think. She was in college, but I don't recall exactly what. But obviously he was in Annapolis to join the Navy. So right after Carter finished his degree in 1946, they married. So that was on July 6, 1946. And they would stay married until she died on November 19th, 2023. So that's a very long marriage. That's 70 years of marriage, almost 80 years of marriage. Yeah, almost 80 years of marriage, yeah. That's a long time to be married to one person, and I think it was probably a very strong marriage. Everything in the book indicates that there was no real, detriments or tragedies behind the scenes. They were a love match, and true partners in life. I'm going to go ahead and mix the rest of the alcohol and a little more peanut butter, and just so I can top off my cocktail. Maybe I'm going to do this. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm. This is a semi-long review. It's 6 pages. It's going to take me a little bit to get through. I probably should get more ice, but I'm just going to... There we go. Solid. They would eventually have 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl, the girl being a surprise baby, Amy, born in 1967, so about 20 years after their oldest was born. Carter would serve 7 years in the U.S. Navy, and Rosalind loved the quasi-nomadic lifestyle of a military spouse. So much so that when Earl died and Carter felt that he had to return to Plains to take over the family business, Rosalind was pissed. Which I totally get. I mean, she'd made it. She'd made it out to the grand, wider world outside of Plains, Georgia. She'd escaped small town. She'd seen the bigger world. She wanted to stay there and be a part of it. And to suddenly be expected to return to that, to small town gossip and the backstabbing and the bitchiness and the weekly bridge games, I mean, I felt a genuine kinship with Rosalind Carter when I read about her irritation over this situation. So that was 1953. So the couple packed up their 3 boys, returned to Plains, Georgia, where Carter experienced a bit of family drama because his younger brother, Billy, had believed that he was going to be inheriting the family business. Not sure why he believed that. Probably because he actually wasn't raised with quite the strictures Jimmy was. Because Jimmy Carter, like I said, had an idyllic lifestyle, but he was raised with the value of hard work, and Billy kind of wasn't. He was the baby of the family, a little bit spoiled. He somehow believed that at 16 he was qualified to run the family business and was really irritated when he wasn't. And when Carter instead stepped in and started running it. So when Billy, as soon as he turned 18, he left and joined the Marine Corps, and he was that mad about the family business. The business, while successful, was not actually all that. He inherited the basic framework, but prior to his death, Earl had forgiven a lot of the debts that were owed to the business, leaving Carter to basically rebuild it from the ground up, which he set about doing and managed quite capably. I mean, whether you love him or hate him as president, I don't think anyone could argue that he was a fully capable human being. I mean, he set himself a task, and with rare exception, he accomplished it. I mean, he knew he needed to build up the family business, so he did. He was a farmer and a businessman for about 10 years, and Rosalind found her place. She kind of came to accept the return to Plains and became the business bookkeeper. She took classes to that effect with the support of Carter. I mean, he wanted his wife to be happy. He just felt that he needed to be in Georgia to take over the family business and support his mother. Now, during this time, civil rights received massive boosts under the Eisenhower administration and the courts, who determined separate but equal was not a thing, and a very failed social experiment. However, Carter, as a closeted non-racist living in deep South Georgia, pretty much kept his opinions to himself. Look, I get it, right? Putting your neck on the line when racial tensions are running high, especially with a wife and 3 young kids, it's fucking terrifying. But you kind of got to wonder about the hypocrisy and what the silence is violence crowd would make of that. I mean, silence is violence, right? He kept fucking silent through all of that. Now, in 1962, Carter decided that the only way to effect some change was to get involved politically, which, I mean, he's not wrong. So he decided to run for the state senator to Georgia legislature. Politics were a lot looser in the 1960s, so Carter announced his candidacy 15 days before the election. And initial returns showed that he had lost. However, this was due to very, very fraudulent voting, which was proven, like conclusively, that there were fraudulent votes going on. And eventually Carter won his lawsuits and was seated as senator with Georgia, which role he would hold until 1966 when he decided to run for Georgia governor. He lost the 66 election, but immediately started campaigning for the 1970 governor's election. Now, when he was sworn in, which he won. I mean, he won because he was the governor from 70 to 74. Now, at this point in Georgia history, I don't know if this is still the case, but back then you could only run for one term as governor. You couldn't run again and again and again. That was one of their ways of making sure to not have political monopolies at the executive level. Legislature was something different, which is why the senator thing was such a big deal. Now, when he was sworn in as governor, Carter immediately annoyed his constituency, who had voted for him basically expecting more of the same, and instead he called for an end to racial divide. I mean, they expected him to maintain status quo, and he's like, no, racism has run its course, we need to look forward, which, good for him, all right? That's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to stand up in front of the people who voted for you and basically tell them to fuck off. Politely, but still. And he set about integrating the government offices of Georgia. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I mean, I'm all for put the best possible person into a job, all right? Merit should be the highest thing that makes that determination. But forcing integration is what led to the tensions in the South during the prior 2 decades. Regardless, he went ahead and did it, and it's hard to say if that was good or bad because the author never really discussed any potential fallout from this. That's actually one of the many frustrating aspects of this book. He discusses the things that Carter does, but doesn't say what happened as a result of XYZ. And nothing is ever Carter's fault, like ever. Sometime around 1972, while still governor of Georgia, Carter decided to run for the president in 1976 and began to campaign. Like truly, like a 4-year marathon campaign, just like he'd done for the governorship. And this was actually the part of the book that sucked the most, believe it or not. It sucked to read because the author went into excruciating, extremely boring detail about the 4-year campaign trail. Excruciating, never-ending, repetitious detail about the 4-year campaign. Like, if you are somebody who deeply follows politics, it might be interesting to you because, especially if you're thinking about making the leap into campaigning yourself, it might actually be a good thing to see how Carter did it. For me, it was not. It was mind-numbing and tedious. Of course, it ended with Carter winning the White House, so I'm sure it was very exciting in the moment. And he was sworn in on January 20th, 1977. Now, his presidency was an absolute clusterfuck. And I mean, the author tried very hard to, for lack of a better phrasing, polish this turd. And this was also very frustrating. So let me explain. Rather than looking at the totality of the presidency, the author cherry-picked specific moments of Carter's time in the White House that the author thought reflected well on Carter. And only mentioned in passing some of the problems. And I had to kind of read through that as best I could and determine what was relevant and what wasn't. Yeah. Now, among the problems, in fact, probably the biggest problem, is that Carter had no connection to the national political scene. I mean, none. He didn't even have connections to the senators and representatives to Congress from Georgia, his own state. He was such a standalone, I am not a politician candidate. And this made it very hard to work with Congress. Now, I mean, I think the only other 2 presidents I've read of who had this hard a time getting along with Congress were John Tyler and Andrew Johnson. And the very different reasons, right? I mean, Tyler's problem was that he refused to sign legislation that was unconstitutional. Johnson's problem that he would veto lawful legislation because he didn't like it. 2 different problems. Carter had no mechanism in place to work with Congress on any legislation. And so he ruled basically by fiat. He just, pass executive orders and get XYZ done, and he would say all of his people speak for him, and that was just part and parcel of his spokes of the wheel style of leadership, which meant that for the first 2 years of his presidency, he did not have a chief of staff. He wanted all of his staffers to have unfettered access to him, and the result was absolute chaos, where basically nobody knew what was going on, at least not that was described in the book, and each staffer created their own little fiefdoms of expertise, and nobody could talk to anybody or contribute because the other person might steal their fiefdom. Carter did appoint, I believe he said it was Hamilton Jordan as his liaison to Congress, which Jordan was his campaign manager and apparently an absolute shit of a human being, at least according to the book. He was a womanizer. He cheated on his wife. He was a pig to women, and the author looks down on him because of that and made it very clear that he didn't like Hamilton Jordan. Carter did. So he appointed Hamilton Jordan to be his liaison to Congress, which was catastrophic because no one, except for Carter, got along with Jordan. And so Congress refused to play ball with Jordan, hence they wouldn't play ball with Carter. And Carter, 2 years into his administration, was finally convinced that he needed a chief of staff, and he appointed Jordan. So apparently he has definite blind spot for the sycophants he surrounded himself with. Carter was inordinately proud of the peace talks he managed to shoehorn through with Israel and Egypt, peace talks which ultimately accomplished nothing because the people of these two countries were not actually willing to follow the suggestions of their leaders who brokered the deal. The author places a lot of the blame for this primarily on Menachem Begin, who was Israel's representative, because Carter got along extremely well with Anwar Sadat from Egypt. So it had to be Begin's fault, not Sadat. And this was a recurring theme throughout the book. Nothing was ever Carter's fault. It was always the other person's fault. Or, and this was my favorite, Carter was the victim of circumstance. The recession was not Carter's fault, it was circumstances beyond his control. Fuel shortages were not his fault, it was beyond his control. Except for the price controls that he put on energy, which any qualified economist could have told him that when you implement price controls, you create scarcity. Hell, I'm only a very, very amateur economist, and I knew that. But Jimmy Carter read a single book on economics, and so he knew what he was doing. And I'm an amateur, clearly. All right. I've read more than one book on economics, and price controls are an absolute catastrophic failure on multiple levels. You go to the Foundation for Economic Education. I think it's fee.org. Lots of articles on why price controls fail. Henry Hazlitt could have undoubtedly told Carter that he was laying the groundwork for an energy crisis. But it wasn't Carter's fault. He was a victim of circumstance. On his first day in office, Carter pardoned all draft dodgers to the absolute outrage of veterans across the nation, basically guaranteeing the loss of that voting bloc in 1980. But that wasn't Carter's fault. That was just the right thing to do. He created the Department of Education, and America's education rates have been in free fall ever since. I think we are very far down on the list, like globally, for our educational levels. We're graduating kids from high school who can't even read. Well done, Department of Education. He created Department of Energy and immediately had the energy crisis, but none of this was Carter's fault, according to the author. Circumstantial. Carter's big wins, as outlined in this book, were appointing a large number of women and minorities to positions of power, so we can pinpoint that horrifying trend to Carter's administration. Not that women and minorities are not qualified, but that it became a trophy to appoint them regardless of actual qualifications. Almost as soon as he took office, he crapped all over the very carefully crafted treaties that Nixon and Ford had worked on with the Soviet Union to disarm. Carter didn't think it was enough, and rather than letting it be and showing that America could be trusted to keep her word, he crapped all over that near decade of work of his predecessors, which caused the USSR to think America was faithless, which then led to the USSR sending 85,000 troops to Afghanistan. We then turned around and sent the CIA into Afghanistan, where we trained Osama bin Laden, which 20-odd years down the road led to 9/11 and a 2-decade war on terror. And you have to wonder, if Carter had just let it be, if he had just let the treaty as already signed be for a few years so that we could, the new relationship with USSR could blossom into genuine trust, would the catastrophic troop withdrawal of August 2021 not have happened? Would 9/11 not have happened? Where would the world be if Carter had not felt the need to prove that only peace as brokered by the great Jimmy Carter was worth having? Cause and effect is a very real thing, but none of this was ever Carter's fault, according to the author, who, by the way, hated Reagan, and when he even hinted that Reagan was showing signs of Alzheimer's while running for president in 1980. Can't comment on that yet, I haven't read the Reagan book, but the author seriously disliked Reagan. He blames Reagan for Carter's losing in 1980 rather than Carter for having failed to build any of the necessary electoral infrastructure to ensure his own triumph. He says Reagan won by asking one simple question: are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, I mean, for most Americans, the answer was a resounding no, and Carter lost the 1980 election, stepping down January 21st, 1981. Post-presidency, Carter has absolutely managed some remarkable things. It's disingenuous to pretend like he hasn't done some truly amazing things in his time since stepping out of the White House. He early jumped into Habitat for Humanity, and not just as a financial contributor. I mean, he actually goes out, or I don't think he still does, but that's more because of age than anything else. He would go out and actually swing a hammer himself. He would build houses for the poor. He spearheaded the Carter Center in Georgia, which has kind of become a neutral territory for political enemies to talk it out. He has been responsible for making sure many third world countries got fair and open elections. And his reputation for such was that, or his reputation is such, that there was at least one election that was canceled outright when he said the country was so corrupt nothing could be done to prevent corrupt elections. And they ended up just canceling it and reconfiguring. I think later did have fair elections. I don't remember which country, but it is in the book. He helped build wells all over Africa and he genuinely tried to assist nations that struggle to find a path forward. And I do believe his own carefully cultivated reputation for integrity and fair dealing has assisted him with all of this. I mean, hell, his post-presidential philanthropy has made him far more interesting as a person than the presidency ever did. However, had he not been president, he likely would not have been in a position to be so philanthropic. So, kind of had to have one to have the other. I mean, nobody would have listened to him if he had just been the governor of Georgia. But a former president, he's done some good things. And it would be dishonest to say he hadn't. He just was not a very good president, in my opinion. I found a chunk of peanut butter. That's delightful. The author spends a lot of time comparing Carter to Jesus. And during the chapters on the presidential campaign, he even calls the Army of Volunteers Carter's disciples. Which, I personally found that distasteful, but everyone has their cult to join. The authors just happen to be the cult of personality that surrounds Jimmy Carter. But if you believe that actions talk and bullshit walks, then Carter is undoubtedly a genuinely good person. All right? His actions show that. Being a good person does not make for a qualified president, which probably says something genuinely horrifying about our political process and politicians in general. But given the fallout from the Carter presidency, I mean, the energy crisis, the Russian troops in Afghanistan, the hostages in Iran, let's not forget about them. They were taken hostage in, I think it was 77, 78. They were not released until Reagan was sworn in, so they were held for a very long time. There was a movie about it. See if I can find it. I don't remember the name of it, but it had Ben Affleck in it. But the author hints that the hostages being released on Inauguration Day 1981 was due to Vice President George Bush using his former CIA contacts to negotiate with the Ayatollah to make Carter look bad, rather than, part of Carter's diplomatic skills, because, seriously, if the Ayatollah had any regard for Carter, why wouldn't he have worked to have the hostages released while Carter still had a shot in hell of winning? I mean, maybe, just spitballing here, just throwing out my own little conspiracy for the world, maybe because Carter's sudden change of heart with the USSR, his pulling them back to the round table to discuss more disarmament than what had already been agreed on after a decade of carefully laid diplomatic communications. He's nosing in on affairs in the Middle East, which nobody asked him to do, nobody really cared for, and didn't really accomplish anything, because, hey, here we are 40 years post-presidency, with the war in Palestine and Israel still going strong. Never really died down. But that's not Carter's fault. I mean, Iran, I think, was already really tired of U.S. nation-building efforts. And I've always heard, and of course this could just be political bias, that the hostages were released on Inauguration Day because Iran was real worried about what Reagan would do if the hostages were not released. It could be both. It could be George Bush doing backseat dealings with the CIA, with his buddies, back-channel dealings. And Reagan was seen as a fucking cowboy, not just from his acting career, but because nobody knew what he would do. And so, regardless, the hostages were released on Inauguration Day, right after Reagan was sworn in. And suddenly I'm back to realizing that Woodrow Wilson was seriously the worst president we've ever had. So how do I get there? How do I get to Woodrow Wilson being the worst president ever off of a book on Jimmy Carter? Well, if he had just kept his 1916 campaign promise to keep us out of the war in Europe, if he'd kept to George Washington's original mandate to avoid entangling alliances, globally, then the United States would never have entered the nation building we did in the early 20th century, which led to a whole lot of evil. Up to and including, if you remember from Wilson's War, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and yes, Osama bin Laden. And it's simultaneously fascinating and horrifying to wonder how the world would turn if America would have just mind her own damn business. And deeply ironic to be outraged at Russian interference in American elections when we've been doing the same globally for a century. And I'm not talking about Carter's ensuring fair elections, democratic elections in third world countries. I'm talking about how we have interfered globally with nations everywhere for our own benefit. The reason the Ayatollah rose in Iran is because we had installed our own preferred dictator, who was not a good guy. I'm not going to lie, he was not a good guy, the Shah of Iran. And yes, women were arguably more free, but the Shah himself was, well, a bit of a shit. Now, we've been doing the same thing for a century, but we're real mad that Russia's doing it to us. I'll have to leave a little bit for the husband. So Carter, other than the ripple effects across time that emanated from his presidency, I am unimpressed with him. Those ripple effects have left me morbidly impressed, though, because I really do wonder if he had just shut his damn mouth and left Nixon and Ford's work alone with Russia, would Afghanistan have ever happened? Would 9/11 have ever happened? Because I am real inclined to think no at this point. This book was meh. And the author was part of Carter's campaign, and I probably would have gotten deeper insights from somebody who was less involved and who wrote from more of a historian's perspective than from an insider's perspective. He absolutely could have cut at least 100 pages by removing the minutiae of the campaign trail, which was completely mind-numbing and boring. This book was released in 1997. Jimmy Carter is still alive and kicking, having just celebrated his 100th birthday, making him the first former president to reach the century mark. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Is that post-election? No. Right before the election. So vote smart, folks. Bye.